ロイタービジネスウィークリーの賀下京子です。毎週アメリカ、特にこちらニューヨークで注目されたニュースをお伝えしています。今週はスタジオに政治学者でユーラシアグループの CEO のイアン・ブレマーさんをお迎えしています。今日はどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。イアン・ブレマー氏はリーダーシップを取る国がない世界を G ゼロと定義して注目を集めているアメリカの政治学者です。今日はこの G ゼロの世界の次にはどんな世界がやってくるのか、ブレマー氏と展望します。Thank you very much for coming to our studio.
Happy to be here.
First of all, would you please define what the G0 world is all about?
Sure. I mean, the G0 world is a world where we have no global leadership. The United States is not willing to provide the same level of leadership it has historically. A lot of Americans believe that they do not benefit as much from being the world's policeman or the lender of last resort. And if that's true of the United States, it's very clear that the Europeans and the Japanese, our allies, are even more distracted. But other countries are not capable of stepping up. And it's very clear that while policymakers and politicians don't want to say that there's a G0, I'm telling you, there's a G0.
So we've been living in this G0 world after the financial crisis in the United States in 2008.
Yeah.
So it's been 4 years.
I think that's right.
So what's going to happen next? The G minus world or G2 world? What is going to happen next?
Well, it depends on two things. The first thing is, what's the nature of the relationship between the United States and China? The two most important economies in the world. China right now number 2, will be number 1 in size. Is that relationship going to be relatively harmonious, or is it going to be conflictual? And the second question is, how important are other countries? Does Europe matter? Do they stay as Europe, and are they able to play a more important role? Does India become more important internationally? Brazil, Japan? And if you can answer those two questions, then you know what's coming next.
ブレマー氏はこの行方を著書 G05 の世界で協調から分裂まで5つのシナリオに分けて説明しています。そしてこの混沌とした世界の中でいかに勝者となるかについても提案しています。And then you mentioned about how can be a winner in the G0 world.
Yes.
One of the ways to become a pivot country.
Yes.
What is that pivot country?
You want to be a country that has the ability to pivot between different kinds of models. If we're moving into a world that is more fragmented, with different coalitions of the willing on trade and climate and finance and security, you want to be able to work with different coalitions because you don't know which coalition is going to do the best. You don't want to be in a situation where, from a political, a security, or an economic perspective, you're stuck with only one country. You don't want to be Taiwan, where Taiwan does very well as long as China does well. You don't want to be Ukraine, where you're stuck with Russia, right? And if Russia does well, Ukraine can do better, but they can't benefit from anyone else. You want to be more like Turkey. You want to be more like Indonesia or Singapore.
So the Japan can be the pivot country or not?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It is clear that it is in the interests of Japan to try to pivot as best they can. If the U.S.-China relationship goes relatively well, the Japanese will be able to pivot. They'll be able to maintain a decent and operational working relationship with China, where there's been a lot of trade and investment, even though there are clearly historical challenges, and they'll maintain a security alliance with the U.S. But as you see the United States shifting its focus to Asia, and you see the Americans working with the ASEAN countries to develop a single focus approach on the South China Sea, for example. You see the Americans paying much more attention to their security engagements with all of their allies across Asia, who are very concerned about China's rise. What does that tell you if you're Japan? It tells you that, wow, we may need to make choices. Pivoting may not be easy for us. We may not be able to maintain a constructive relationship with China over the long term. It will, in a G0 world, the longer the G0 persists, the harder it is for the Japanese to pivot effectively. The Japanese will be able to maintain very strong relations with lots of other countries. The Japanese need to do much more investing in sub-Saharan Africa. These are big opportunities. It's important. They need to invest much more in Southeast Asia. They need to invest much more with countries that develop energy around the world. You look at the gas prices in Japan compared to the United States or Europe, you see the effect of not pivoting effectively historically. These are real challenges.
When you talk about the bilateral relationship between Japan and China, they're so close to each other. They have some territory issues at this moment, same with Korea.
Yeah.
And in that bilateral relationships that Japan has with Korea and China, I just can't imagine how Japan can pivot in that kind of situation.
Well, I think that's right. I think that the territorial issues between Japan and China are not going to get resolved. They're likely to get worse. I will say that, strategically, it makes no sense for Japan and South Korea to have these relations. I mean, South Korea is going to be part of the TPP as it's developed the Trans-Pacific Partnership along with the U.S. and Japan. If the United States wants to pivot effectively towards Asia, one of the most important things to do for Obama or Romney, whoever in 2013, is work to facilitate an improved Japanese-South Korean relationship. One of the most important things they can do.
So there is not, I don't say it's a leadership, but there is some influence from America about this issue too.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, when I say that there's an absence of leadership, I don't mean that the U.S. suddenly doesn't exist on the international stage. But to be clear, we've had 18 months of war in Syria. We've had over 20,000 people dead. The United States is not going to send boots on the ground. It's different from what you would have seen in the Bush administration. They're removing troops from Afghanistan. Obama expanded the troops, not anymore. And despite the fact that they expanded the troops in Afghanistan and they're losing the war, Romney gives a speech at the National Convention and doesn't mention it, doesn't criticize Obama. Why? Because the Americans just don't care. They don't want to hear about Afghanistan. They want to hear about the U.S. They want to hear about the economy. They want to hear about jobs. That's what they're interested in. That is frankly different from where we were historically.
So in the G0 world, or after, I should say after the G0 world, so does it make a huge difference if Romney is elected or the Obama is elected?
It doesn't make a huge difference. G0 world did not come because we had Obama or Bush. These issues are structural. The gap between rich and poor in the U.S. has been expanding for decades under Republican and Democratic administrations.
So having said that, but there is an election coming in November.
Yes.
In the end, who do you think is going to win?
Obama is beatable. He is not hugely liked. He is vulnerable on the economy. His health care issue is very polarizing in the United States. Having said that, Romney is an incredibly weak candidate. Most independents in the United States look at Romney and they think of a banker. On the one hand, you have Obama, who's charismatic, that gets support from the base, but who is truly hated by people on the other side. And then you have Romney, who just doesn't inspire a lot of enthusiasm. And even with all the money Romney is making in terms of raising for the election, Obama clearly still has an advantage. So I guess, sitting here right now, I would say Obama's likely to win. I'd probably put it at about 60-65%.
So finally, I want to go back to the topics to Japan.
Sure.
You were very, very optimistic about Japanese recovery.
At 3/11, the Japanese have experienced the worst national crisis since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the ability of the Japanese to get through that with their political system completely intact, rebuilding their supply chain completely within 6 months' time, with the ability of the entire country to ration energy voluntarily in many cases without complaint. There have been demonstrations, anti-nuclear demonstrations, an issue that has a great deal of importance for the Japanese historically. But we've not seen violence. This is not Tunisia, this is not Egypt, it's not Greece. I think that there's a lot to learn from Japan, absolutely. And it's precisely in the way that countries respond to challenges that you learn. You do not learn when everything is easy, what people are made of. You learn when things are hard.
Great, thank you very much. 今週は以上です。来週もロイターがアメリカのトピックスをまとめてお伝えいたします。ロイタービジネスウィークリーの賀社京子がニューヨークロイタースタジオからお伝えしました。それではまた来週。